Hello there people, Happy New Year. This is going to be the first video I post in 2025. We're going to have a talk about why sticking to one ecosystem can really boost your photography career. What do I mean by an ecosystem? Have you ever sat there looking at your gear and realised you only have Apple computers or accessories? You only have Sony lenses and cameras, even though you could get a Sigma one, etc, etc. DJI. Do you only have DJI microphones, a DJI drone, a DJI gimbal, and etc.? That's an ecosystem. An ecosystem is something that is designed to integrate and to work really well with each other. Doesn't matter which one you go for. I'm a Mac person and have a lot of Apple gear. I'm also a Canon person when it comes to my camera gear. This will apply for Sony, it will apply for Nikon, it will apply for any gear you have, but let's talk about sticking to the gear. One of the reasons why sticking to gear is so useful is when it comes to upgrades or adjusting your gear, it makes your life significantly easier. So recently last year, 2024, I'm filming in 2024, but it'll be posted in 2025, I swapped over from the 5D Mark IV to the Canon R3. What did that mean? It means I went from the EF, the older mounting system that I think Canon have been using since the 80s. My head says 84, but I'm probably going to be wrong there. Over to the RF system, which is their mirrorless lenses. This meant that my lenses weren't directly compatible and they're not backwards compatible, but it does mean that Canon made a handy dandy adapter. Nikon has done the same thing, and that's the only brands that I know about. I think Sony's basically always been mirrorless. They kind of went into this with mirrorless, so I don't think that needed to happen. But anyway, my point is, by sticking to the same brand, I was able to use the first-party adapters to work with my gear, and I could trust that I would have no issues. This meant I could slowly upgrade my gear by buying a new lens every now and again when I felt something was lacking or I needed the upgrade. And now I'm at a point where all of my gear is directly RF lenses. You could do the same with Nikon when they went from their old mount to the Z mount. I can't remember what the old mount was called. I've never shot Nikon, and etc. It also means going forward, you can save a little bit of money. There's a really famous photography saying, which is, marry your lenses, date your bodies. What does this mean? It means that spend more money on lenses, because in theory, they're going to last you the longest amount of time. Bodies you'll upgrade every few years. This is true. I mean, I had my 50mm 1.2 for over 10 years. That's a significant time to have a lens. So my investment in the lens was quite low when you break it down. This is going to be the same going forward with whatever camera brand you stick to. So if you spend good money in lenses, you're going to lock yourself into the ecosystem. So pick something you like. So learn if there are any random shortcomings. For example, something you might not know, Hasselblad cameras don't work with Capture One, the tethering and library management and editing system. That is because Capture One is made by Phase One. Phase One is a competing brand of medium format cameras. That means that they've just not allowed the software to work with it. Weirdly enough, they do allow Fuji in their GFX line. I just thought that. Not a problem, you can use Lightroom. But if you are really stuck into Capture One, you've used it for years and you don't use Adobe, it's something you might need to know going forward. So do a little bit of research. Also, when moving and buying new gear, hopefully your systems will be similar and you'll understand how to use them. This isn't always true, and it's actually one of the reasons I'm not the biggest Sony fan. So I am a Canon person, so I've shot with for years, and the menu system on my 5D Mark I, my 5D Mark IV, my R3 are all very, very similar. And if I gave someone who's only used an R1 an R3, they'd be able to find in the menus the settings they wanted. On the flip side, I've had very little experience with Sony. I've used them a few times on gigs and for work, etc. And I remember very distinctly there being a one generation difference. So I think it was the A7 IV and the A7 V, but don't quote me. It was the A7 line. And the menu system had completely changed between the two models. and I was struggling to find stuff, and I had to Google it like every time. I couldn't just intuitively find it. I understand if I own the system, it'd be easier to use, but I like to have gear that I can easily work with and understand. So it's a turning point for me. It's like that I'm not the biggest fan of. There's also a bit of an underrated point that not a lot of people talk about, which is buying a popular product gives you support. Well, what do I mean by this? Okay, so call me an Apple fanboy if you want. No, please do. It's really good for the engagement. Um, Apple devices get a lot of support because they are very popular. So if you make a iPhone compatible app or an iPhone compatible accessory or an iPhone etc., Apple only makes a few phones each year, and as long as your compatibility is like a couple of generations backwards, you've got a huge target market. If you're making, for example, a case for an Android phone, how many brands of Android phones are there? Like you've got Sony, Huawei, Google Pixels, Samsungs that are going to be more Honor. That's all I think of off the top of my head. But it's a lot of money for a brand to invest in all of those. So typically, for example, I think Peak Design, if you go onto their website, I think they only do cases for the Google Pixel line and the Samsung line. And even then, it's only the premium Samsungs, not the budget Samsungs. Something to think about. If you're going for a device that is very popular, the flagship Samsungs, the Pixels, although they're doing better. They weren't the best for a long while. With like consumer knowledge, and if consumers don't know it, then products don't get made. But Samsung is normally a good one to stick to because everyone makes cases and accessories for them. Things like the Peak Design mountable cases they do for phones, they do for tripods, etc. I'm trying to think of other brands. DJI do a lot of MagSafe stuff. So MagSafe was Apple's like magnetic phone case. You're not going to be able to see it. It's like a ring in here to show like the magnetic bit. It's how that case that I was showing in my other video stuck to the phone back of my phone. As far as I'm now aware, that technology has now been opened up to other brands, but it was originally Apple only. So there was a lot of devices that are being made for MagSafe that obviously weren't Android compatible. They are, I think, now. Something to think about. You know, just it helps if you can stick within an ecosystem. And obviously, if you're buying accessories that work for MagSafe now, if you go for an Android phone in the future that doesn't have MagSafe, you've spent money on accessories you're not going to use. It's one way you get locked into stuff. Okay, now for the meat of the video. How is your career going to get boosted by sticking to the same gear? Possibly a clickbait title, but I don't think it is. Part 1, reliability. I think you should know your gear, and I think I'm going to do a video specifically about knowing your gear, because so many people don't understand where the settings are for something, how to do a feature, etc. By using the same ecosystem, the same gear all the time, and learning the ins and outs of your camera, you'll understand how to get better pictures. By getting better pictures, you get better bookings. By getting better bookings, you get more money. You're doing well at your career. I know, for example, that my R3, I can shoot probably up to 24,000 ISO and still not have noticeable noise and grain that's going to affect my images. That means I know and can trust it to do extreme low light photography. It's one of the reasons I got the camera. I also know that my 5D Mark IV, that if I went above 2000 ISO, I'd start getting grain. So I stuck to the lower ends and I used continuous or flashlight to compensate for that. I learned that about my camera. It helped me progress. I was able to work within the constraints or go into the grain, but manage expectations of the client or specifically make it a stylistic choice. Brand specific features. Trying to think of some that I actually use. Uh, Canon now has, it came out in the R1, it's been added to the R3, where you could take a picture of someone's face and then you can have that person tracked and there'll be a focus point, like your priority of focus will go to them. Sounds weird. I mean, you should always be able to get the perfect focus. Realistically, no. So why do I like this? Weddings, it's absolutely amazing. If you're doing, if you put the bride in there and the groom in there, it'll always stick to their faces. you never want really shots of the bride and groom out of focus. So it's just a key skill for that. Key skill, useful feature for that. I've got friends who work in like motorsports, and they like doing it for like specific drivers. So they will have a driver saved, or again, football players. If there's specific football players that have, I don't know, this sounds really bad, but if there's been some kind of news article about a footballer or some kind of gossip or some anything like that, there's a particular reason there's focus in on that person, then they'll try and get shots of that person throughout the game to highlight how good they're doing, etc. It's a feature that can be used. I know people in sports will sometimes do that. No features that don't work with your camera. So I just said about Capture One not working with Hasselblad cameras. Is that a deal breaker for you? Is your whole studio set up to use Capture One? Do all your Digitechs know how to use Capture One, but no one knows how to use Lightroom Classic? Is Lightroom Classic a big deal breaker because it doesn't have the remote capture features where you can show a client? Is that a deal breaker for you? If it is, then that's not going to help you to achieve success in your career if you can't use that feature. Another weird one, networking. Um, Canon will do occasional events where they'll let people go to them. They'll host events. They put it online on Eventbrite. Local camera clubs. People will always gravitate towards other people who use the same gear as them or the same systems. It's a good way to borrow gear. I mean, I've got friends that I will lend my gear to. I've got friends who lend me gear. We don't own every lens. We're never going to own every lens, but having a group of trusted friends that I can lend a lens to or be lent a lens expands my, the amount of gear I have. I don't currently own 85mm prime. My friend Sean does. She doesn't currently own the 50mm 1.2. We'll often swap those lenses for different events or borrow one and then lend it to the other one. She's borrowed my 7200 for a wedding recently. As long as I'm not using the lens at the same time, my gear is free game to friends. It's a really good way to network. Sometimes you get second shooting jobs, sometimes you get first shooting jobs. Because if someone is being booked for something and they can't do it, but they trust you, a recommendation from the person who is being booked that can't do it is going to be better than you just going in and saying, "Hi, client, I can do this job." Good way to get more work. And here's the one I don't like talking about. Clients notice your gear. It's going to really sound like I'm hating on Sony. It's not. I have enough imposter syndrome in my life, thinking that I hate my work. Why is anyone like this? So being critiqued as a photographer is always an internal thing I hate. But a friend of mine had this who's a really good wedding photographer. They have done all sorts of weddings. They've flown around the world doing weddings. And they upgraded from Nikon to Sony when they went mirrorless. And it was literally the first wedding they did. And they had like 4 or 5 comments from older gentlemen, all basically saying, can the bride and groom afford a real photographer? Because they thought that the really small, compact Sony camera didn't look like a professional level gear. Unfortunately, classic Nikon or Canon big bodies are what people associate with proper photography. So when you don't have one of those, it could be a little bit of an issue for people. That's one of the reasons I also won't go Sony, is I'm scared that will happen to me, and I'm sticking to my big Canon. It's another reason I go for the R3. I'm overcompensating for my fear. But clients will notice gear. I've often had clients who like to think they're photographers, or at least are amateur hobbyist photographers, and they will notice that I'm shooting on L series glass because Canon has the red ring on the lens. It's obvious if you know Canon that the red stuff is their more expensive lenses. It makes you look like a proper photographer. I've been to events as a guest, and I've overheard other guests saying stuff about someone using a cheap lens or cheap gear. When you're getting into higher levels of gear, higher levels of gigs, they are expecting you to have better gear. If they're paying you a large amount of money, they expect you to have a large amount of gear for that money. You don't necessarily have to own it, you can rent it, but clients will expect to see some gear there. Um, Another one, um, Macs. Clients will expect to see a MacBook. Sometimes I've seen a lot of photographers also use like Windows Surface devices, but those are seen as like flagship devices. You could have the most top spec'd out Alienware computer, but most clients in the creative industry aren't going to know who Alienware are. So, from a brand recognition standpoint, that won't work, or at least them. I do actually know a photographer who absolutely hates using a Mac. Years ago, they used to run Boot Camp, which meant they could run Windows on their Mac. Now, what they do is they have their Mac, or they buy a Mac. They shows they earn too much money. I'm joking. They deserve their money. They'll buy a Mac. They will have it for 4 or 5 years. All they do with it is transfer the photos off of it from the camera card to the laptop for the client to see them, and they'll pick through the ones that the client wants. So they'll like favorite them or whatever, and then they'll get home or back to their studio and they'll get all those photos onto the Windows computer and they'll edit them on the Windows computer. Their Mac is basically a glorified photo screen. Yeah, I'm very jealous of that person from a finance point of view. I wish I had the spare money to just buy a spare Mac. But like I'm saying, it's unfortunately it's something that clients do see, will see, and it's a necessary evil, as they say. How would you choose an ecosystem? I can't really answer this for you. You've got to play with ecosystems, play with cameras, see if there's anything that an ecosystem is lacking. Again, it sounds like I'm harboring on Hasselblad. I really want to buy a Hasselblad, and I don't use Capture One, so this isn't an issue for me. But check if there's any features that are missing. Check gear prices, because if you're buying if you're locking yourself into like Nikon, how much Nikon lenses are going to be going forward? What's the second-hand market like with Nikon lenses, um, etc. Same with Canon. Does Canon have the lenses you want at the moment? They might have had it in the EF range, but what if it's not launched yet in the RF range? Some people are critiquing Canon for being a little bit slower with their new lenses coming out. Things to think about. Is that going to affect you? If you walked into the camera store now, can you buy all the lenses that you need for your job? If not, can you make it work by adapting an older lens? And if you're completely switching gear, so if you're going Canon to Sony, Sony to Nikon, Nikon to Canon, however you want to do it, are you going to be able to adapt it, or you have to sell your gear, trade in, etc.? Look at the future of your lenses and future of your gear. For example, Nikon has just brought out an older mount lens. I can't remember what lens it is. It came out like 3 or 4 months ago, I think, or recently. I spoke to someone about it, and they're a photographer by hobby, but work in research and development and engineering stuff for a completely different industry. They're in cosmetics. But they said what will happen is a piece of technology or like a product will be getting designed and they'll be making it, and then other things will be happening at the same time. So what they basically said was all the money was spent to make this lens and to develop this lens, and orders will have been put, and there might have been delays that stopped it being made as quickly. Then the new mount will have been launched, and they've still got to make this old lens because they've got all the product and stock coming. Um, I know that I believe, as far as I'm aware, Canon, for example, has stopped production of EF mount lenses. They're not making any more EF stuff because they've now got budget, prosumer, and professional R mount lenses, RF glass and bodies. So they've gone fully into mirrorless. Sony, as far as I'm aware, has like always been fully mirrorless. That's not really a fear on Sony. Nikon, I'm not sure. They're still making some of the old, I think it's FE mount, but I can't remember, or F mount. They're still making some of those lenses, so that could be a little bit of a issue. So, how about if you need to change ecosystems? Is there ever a time? Yeah. Um, Sony's are absolutely amazing for hybrid shooting. I know a lot of videographers and that do video and photo who love their Sonys. I know a lot of people who don't necessarily like Canon for video work because a lot of the Canon photo focus cameras don't have the codecs that they want. I think my R3 has C-Log 1 and C-Log 3, and everyone has C-Log 2. I can't remember. Like I've said previously, I'm mainly iPhone for video, unless I'm doing stuff for clients. I'm normally only assisting in that phase, and I get them to tell me the settings they want, and we do it. So you might need to adjust your gear to make it work for your workflow or to improve what you're doing. Make sure it's calculated. Make sure you are trying to get the most out of the gear you've already got. Gas is a real thing, gear acquisition syndrome. You don't need to spend more money on gear if the gear you've already got is going to do what you need it to do. Try renting other cameras first. So before you sell all of your Nikon gear and go to Sony, make sure you rent a Sony and a lens for a couple of weekends. Try doing some work. See if you can actually get the results you're wanting out of it. If you're not, then you've saved yourself some money. Look for trade-in offers. When you're going to sell your gear, look for brands and companies that go do trade-ins. Your local camera store often do some really good trade-in deals, especially if you go in there with a bulk set of gear that they can sort of easily sell. I remember talking to someone, they were really surprised when they went second-hand shopping and they got, I think it was a 400mm f4. It was like one of the large like wildlife lenses, and they got it for such a cheap price. They're like, how do I get it so cheap? These retail for whatever price it was. And the guy in the like local camera store was literally like, we this is such a hard lens to sell. So few people want a 400mm like lens that when we get one in for trading value, we don't give it a huge value, but also we don't sell it for a huge markup because it's going to be stuck on our shelf, hard to sell, hard to resell. So, you know, speak to them. Like certain more niche lenses might not go well, but if you've got 50mm 1.2, 85 1.2, 70 to 200, 35 1.4, like those lenses that are classic lenses, and you're swapping gear over, it's something you can do, and like a lot of places will give you good money for those. Okay, so let's wrap up. Sticking to one ecosystem can save you money, save you time, help advance your career by allowing you to network, to go to events, to use your gear better, and save money in the long run if you're sticking with an ecosystem. There are advantages to swapping and changing, but you've got to make sure you're choosing the right reasons for it. So please, if you could like, follow, subscribe, put a comment down below. I want to know what brand of camera you're using. I did a poll on Threads, and Canon was #1 for my followers, followed by Sony, and then I had a couple of more niche responses like Panasonic and Phase One. I'd love to know what you guys are using. Please let me know in the comments below and subscribe. Keep on watching.